Hey everyone, welcome. Um, I'm gonna wait a couple more minutes. It seems like we've still got a few folks streaming in. I feel like we've hit critical mass though. Anyway, hey everybody. Uh, Welcome to our latest L1 AMA. For anyone joining for the first time or one of their first times, this is basically a regular info series we give on the LAMINA1 Discord where we update the community about our latest feature releases, fill you in on what we're developing and designing together, and answer questions just basically around what we're up to and how it fits into our vision and what we're building for LAMINA1 and the open metaverse at large. So, as you can probably tell by the event invite and the live event description, the topic of today's AMA is creator rights. So, we're basically here to talk about how Web3 and blockchain are transforming IP and ownership, why that matters, and what we're building to empower creator rights at Lamina1. Sort of accompanying this AMA is a ton of background. We launched an L1 education series and blog post last week that kind of talks about a lot of these topics in depth. So I'm going to share that in the chat here in case no one's caught up on that. But basically, we dive deep into the topic. We give you a bit of background behind the current sort of very early V1 versions of setting rights and credits on the LAMINA1 hub when creating content. Um, and basically just kind of like also just overviewing the scope of the problem or the sort of like issues that we're tackling by adding, a creator rights and royalties framework to Lamina1. The blog post kind of talks about how fragmented the system is right now, how creators obviously don't have a lot of power in claiming ownership and, receiving royalties in the sort of Web 2.0 world, and dives into like how blockchain and NFTs and smart contracts are seeking to sort of like give some of that power back into creators' hands. That said, if you're not into reading, listening here is also a great way to learn more about what we're building straight from the mouths of the people who are designing and developing our platform for creator rights and enforceable royalties on Lamina1. So basically on that note, today I'm joined once again by our Chief Technology Officer, Will Carter, and our Chief Product Officer, Gordon Maddie, to dive into some of your questions around creator rights and also to give you all a bit of like a preview and kind of walk you through what to expect as we continue barreling toward mainnet launch in Q2, Q3 2024. So, Will, Gordon, how are you guys doing? You guys ready to dive in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it.
All right, awesome. So, all right, I'm going to pull up my question list now as just kind of a quick stat update. We got in over 500 responses to last week's creator rights survey and Q&A forum. A ton of interesting feedback from you all on the new sort of rights and credits features many of you may have tested and noticed are currently live in the Creator Studio whenever you create an artwork or a custom laser via those demo templates. So I guess, to dive right in, a question from our first community member, Igor7566 Duality, asks, what considerations did the L1 core team take into account in developing the current sort of customizable rights framework that we see on Lamina1? Like, what were you guys like thinking about? Like, what are we seeking to address and tackle with this seemingly simple kind of part in this flow?
Yeah, I'll kick off. I think Will probably has some thoughts as well here. Our starting point was really kind of looking at the current state of the art of what was out there and trying to move the needle forward essentially in terms of taking a first step towards resolving some of the kind of challenges that we see. The reality is that across the internet at large, whether you're publishing content on a blockchain or even publishing content directly on a website that you own or through Facebook or a social network, the specification of like the rights around the kind of asset that you might be publishing is completely invisible, right? There is no information that's being typically published alongside an asset. And so you end up seeing kind of behaviors in Facebook and Instagram where people try and express their rights in the description of the asset, for example, right? Or people take an asset and acknowledge that this asset has been taken from someone else, and then they kind of ask for the creator to let them know whether or not they should be attributed or how to be attributed. So the current processes that exist today and the way things are manifested requires a lot of manual effort. And then when we look at kind of blockchain and particularly kind of the rise of NFTs, in particular in the last kind of cycle, a lot of the information about the rights is also just not simply declared within the asset that's published. And so what that means is that when I go to, say, OpenSea, and I look at I look at an asset, I can't understand kind of necessarily what rights I'm getting if I was to buy the asset. And if they are declared, then it's probably encoded in some kind of terms of service somewhere. Very similar to the way that content you might publish on Instagram is also kind of captured in the context of the terms of service, where you're actually giving the platform rights to that content as well, so they can use it and distribute it, etc. And so our first step was really to try and start solving some of these issues around lack of transparency. And what that means is thinking about how we might encode rights within an asset on chain so that they are there and they are declared. There were many other questions to talk about later on in terms of how you actually enforce that, and does the person who expressed that copyright ownership or license actually have the rights to do that. That's a little bit of a different question, but the first step was really like, how can we encode do two things. Number one, anyone that might be looking at an asset will be able to understand what rights have been specified around that asset, and secondarily starting to put in some structures so that we can think about how to make those rights programmable on chain. And I think that that's the most interesting thing about blockchains in particular, is your ability to start to build logic around how rights are used and inherited, etc., for kind of programmable use within smart contracts. So that was kind of really the starting point. Let's make it more transparent. And then the second consideration was, we're building a global platform, and the reality is that copyright regulation is different in different countries and at different levels of maturity. And so to that end, we kind of looked at what we could take advantage of. And so we ended up choosing Creative Commons as a starting point to actually kind of use their international copyright licensing agreements to encode those rights into its legal structure. And so that was really kind of our goal, is like, how do we support everyone? How do we make things more transparent? And the future obviously is evolving that to cover lots of other potential use cases, and also started to think about considering the source of assets and where they came from as well. So we'll talk a bit more about what that looks like a bit later on, I think, with some follow-up questions.
Yeah, I think kind of like yeah, I guess kind of like on that note, so Gordon, you mentioned like, we used Creative Commons as kind of a starting off point, but I mean, before we get too deep into like the why or the technical stuff, like, can you guys just give us like kind of a brief overview of the current kind of creator rights covered in the studio and like why we picked those in particular? Like it's a pretty small sample at the beginning. I think it's, like 5 questions that you currently have the flow, but like I think giving a little bit of an overview as we kick off this AMA on like what those rights are and why we picked those first, I think would be super helpful.
Yeah, sure. So I think the rights that we chose. So firstly, like any creative work that anyone creates has copyright on it as soon as you create it. right? In the United States, you can do additional things like register with the Copyright Office and things like that to get a number related to that piece of work. However, and so we started from a point of view, well, let's assume that the person has the rights to this work. So the first question is like, do you actually want to provide a license for it, or do you want to retain and reserve all copyrights to it? What that means essentially is starting to understand, what people might want to be able to do with the work. The second question is around attribution. So, if people use your work and create derivatives of that work, being able to ensure that you will be attributed as kind of derivative work gets created on the platform. And by having that information, we can, from a UI perspective and also kind of what's encoded on chain, we can make sure that those links are there to the originator of that work so the attribution can be enforced. The next question is around commercial use. So again, understanding whether or not you want somebody to be able to make money from a piece of derivative work. And that's obviously very tightly encoded to royalties, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later. And again, it's about knowing what you actually want to be able to use the work or allow the work to be used for. And then the final question was one that we thought was really, really important to understand really people's sentiment towards AI and understanding whether or not people want that asset to be able to be used in AI training. And again, so that can be respected by others. So those are really the choices, and we thought that covered, the major use cases. It obviously doesn't cover non-authorized uses, just like on the internet, right? Right-click save as is a meme for NFTs, but that reality is that exists across the web en masse anyway. And it's really more about like, what rights do I want to give out? What are the parameters of those? And making sure we kind of capture that information so that it can be presented in the future and ultimately programmed against.
Awesome. Will, do you have anything to add before I dive into some more kind of like specific questions, just kind of around the like, what are we building with regards to like rights and royalties, and what kind of perspective are you coming at this from?
Yeah, so I think Gordon did a pretty good job of setting the stage for it. Another aspect or goal that we have is to sort of start to envision the framework for what new or emerging IP that might be purposefully developed to be expanded upon or co-created with a fan community might look like. And so like Gordon mentioned AI tools, and I think it's going to be obviously a trending topic here for content creators over the next few years. And I think with that advent of tools, co-creation is going to be inevitable, like sanctioned or not. So one thing we think about is there a good way to establish some rights and royalties ahead of time that sort of embrace these tools and this co-creation potential, and enable it in a controlled manner versus spending a lot of time and effort and maybe futilely like failing at doing it, at trying to control and prevent this co-creation. So I think like the co-creation of content is inevitable. And so that's another thing we're looking at is like how can we facilitate that co-creation in a controlled manner that still respects the goals of the original content creator. I see this anecdotally a lot in the entertainment space. We're being too protective of content IP to the extent that it limits sort of convenient access from normally honest consumers, can actually lead those consumers to instead pirate the content or find new ways to access it. And so I think a similar thing can happen here, where AI will make it so easy to make derivative content and get around traditional controls that you could either stand out by facilitating it in an empowering and interesting way, or really struggle to fight against what will probably be a flood of unapproved derivative content. So that's another thing is that we're keeping in mind when we develop this stuff is how do we think these new tools and like this notion of a metaverse, interoperability and co-creation, how can we enable that while still protecting the original IP creators' goals and needs.
Awesome. Gordon, I know you mentioned that this is like, it's definitely like an early framework. We got a question from Ruzar Boos, who calls out, are these measures, like, are the 5 things that we have on the current creator rights flow, are they sufficient to fully protect digital content? Like, is this everything? I think I definitely want to give you like a chance to kind of talk about like what is covered, what isn't covered, like what's the next steps for what we're building.
Yeah, the reality is that it doesn't kind of express the nature of copyright licensing globally in the way that it's that it's done, and in particular some industries, such as music, for example, have a much more complex set of rights, and particularly on the royalty side of things, on how it's all managed. Actually, Jackie Gill put a comment around there was a 14 standards issue here, which is true in some ways, but it's actually worse than that because probably hundreds of different types of rights agreements that are out there in any particular industry. And so I think, we certainly want to be able to support some flexibility there. And we imagine a future where there will be a way to actually express the rights in a much more dynamic way, rather than just being restricted to the licenses that have been by lawyers. There's really some interesting work happening in this space. So, for example, a company called Creative Intel that's focused in the music space and actually using AI to be able to generate rights agreements to structure exactly the type of rights that they want. And so we think that there's going to be possibly a situation where there's actually lots of different there's not a single agreement that anyone is going to say, oh yeah, that's the agreement for me. And it will end up actually being a little bit more complicated than that in reality, not complicated, but maybe more nuanced or complex in terms of what you want to give. And so we think that there needs to be a lot more flexibility kind of within the rights specification ultimately. So that's really one area that we're thinking about how that might need to be expanded in the future, and probably the most important in terms of the types of creators that we're talking to across the industries, such as music and film and TV and fashion, etc., where we have to consider all of these different contexts.
Yeah, definitely. I remember when we first kind of dived into even this, it was like I did a ton of research around like what are film rights, what are music rights, what are NFT rights, and I quickly like just exploded my brain over like the course of 2 days trying to like get every use case down. But I think ultimately like a big problem that I immediately found when even doing that early like kind of product and positioning research was just like if you need a full-on legal degree to be able to negotiate how your work is shared and distributed, like man, like so it's like it was a really interesting thing where it's like how do we cover all of the use cases while also making it like simple and easy to use and like not requiring like legal intermediaries every time you want to publish a piece of content onto the internet. Anyway, I'm not going to go too deep into that. I've got another one for you, Will, from Todd Craw Fusion X Finance, who just kind of asks, aside from the kind of like front end, like creator rights flow, like, can you provide some insights into the technical architecture and mechanisms being developed behind rights and royalties on LAMINA1? So basically, like, if we open up the hood behind this like super simple front end, like, what are some of the things that are happening?
Yeah, so we kind of look at these rights and royalties at various stages or layers in the stack of the LAMINA1 platform. So one of them is what's currently available and what Gordon was referring to, which is like easy to understand and use tools for actually expressing and establishing the rights that you need. And that includes like an educational component. It might include an AI component to help you kind of navigate all the intricacies of what different royalty terms might mean to you or rights terms might mean to you. So that's one aspect of it, sort of at a very high level. At the platform level, the application level, we ensure that the UX for both making those rights and royalties, but also consuming content in the process of consuming content, that those rights and royalties are very transparent, they're user-facing, but that they're also enforced within the scope of the Lamina1 platform at the application layer level. So ensuring that all the applications that integrate with Lamina1 as well as the hub itself respect the rights and royalties that you've established within items. Then, of course, you always have to sort of deal with the inevitability of people trying to bypass those restrictions. And there's kind of two different ways we try to mitigate those issues. One of them being by leveraging sort of AI and community tools for detecting and flagging content that violates rights and royalties. That's something that's forward-looking, but it's something that I've spent a lot of time working with David Chom, who kind of envisioned a way for content moderation, utilizing and leveraging your community and empowering them through incentives and something that's called random sampling to sort of create on-demand juries of your peers to review, flagged content. So I think we want to probably leverage stuff like that eventually, as well as AI tools to make it easy to detect what types of content need to be brought in front of, say, a community jury. And then obviously ways in which you can then either blacklist or deal with the content that has been found to violate the integrated rights and royalties of a specific item or content. And then finally, there's on-chain mechanics at the blockchain level itself, which kind of limit the ways that sophisticated users can bypass either the platform or application level enforcement of these terms. And I think we might be talking about that in a follow-up question, but those generally, it's something we've talked about in the past where you basically give the creator the tools by which they can define which marketplaces or which smart contracts are allowed to interact with their content. And so that limits some of the wrapping approaches and other technical means by which people bypass the traditional integrated royalties.
Yeah, I definitely had a follow-up question from Ivana6923 and a bunch of people, I think in general, after we kind of published some initial stuff in the L1 users and developers guide around creator rights, is just kind of how exactly are you going to enforce these things, right? Blockchain is super decentralized, Lamina1 is going to be working with, not just our own platform, but with other open metaverse platforms and stuff too. So yeah, we got a number of questions from folks just around how does the enforceability work? And also would love if you could give us a little bit of detail around, I know our path to enforcement is not going to be all of the sudden enforceability is live everywhere. It's kind of going to be this gradual building. So I'd love for you to kind of just talk that out a little bit more. Again, got a ton of questions around it the second that we started talking about rights. Okay, it's all fine and good that I've put my settings, but how do you make sure that people respect this?
Yeah, so again, there's kind of two ways that there's the way that it's traditionally been done in the Web3 ecosystem, which is kind of going to be our first phase of this process, and that would be to embed the rights and royalties directly into the item itself, and then any marketplace or platform that has been developed to respect the standard by which these rights and royalties are expressed will respect them. And so if you, some marketplaces, if you buy or sell an item, there will be a royalty stream that goes back through to the original content creator in secondary sales. This is pretty standard. It's been well used within the Web3 ecosystem, but there's been some very public and popular instances where major marketplaces have chosen to ignore these royalties over time. And so the second phase is a way for you as a content creator, and I'll talk about this as a trade-off you have to decide to make, but it gives you the tools as a content creator to decide which marketplaces your item is compatible with. And so you do this generally with something that's called a whitelist, where you basically restrict any smart contract or platform that's not on that whitelist from being able to interact in some ways with that content. So in this case, it might be in order to transfer this NFT to another address, it needs to be done within the constraint of one of these whitelisted marketplaces. Now, that's a very strong protection because you can basically review each and every one of those marketplaces, see if they are respecting your royalties, and if they aren't, you can remove them from that whitelist immediately. But it's also, as I was saying before, it kind of limits access to your content in some ways. So now that I have an NFT, it starts to limit the types of marketplaces or platforms in which I might deploy it. And so there is going to be sort of a trade-off between making these items, completely interoperable and portable across any environment versus ensuring that whatever environment they are being deployed in is respecting the rights and royalties that you embedded originally in that content. So we don't kind of presume to make that choice for you on that trade-off, but we do provide you the tools to do it. And it's something you can change over time. So you might decide, in the first year that I want to ensure that only whitelisted approved marketplaces and smart contracts can interoperate with this content. And then after a year, I'll turn off those restrictions. And so that's also something that's possible. And so there are ways to use these tools to sort of meet a middle ground. But that's kind of the gist of it. It's called the Limit Break 1155C standard, if anyone wants to go check it out.
Yeah, I did some linking to that in the blog post. Will, you flagged me towards that. You're like, look into limit break. That's like what we're interested in using. So yeah, if you go into that blog post that I linked up earlier, we've got a diagram from the limit break team and some explanations of how those enforceable royalties sort of work on their
Real
end.
quick.
Yeah.
Real quick, it looks like Wilson asked a really good question on this, which I just wanted to address while we're on the topic, which is like approved by who? So like who's actually setting this whitelist? Which is something we've thought a lot about as well, which, you again, as the creator, get to decide which whitelist you use. It could be a whitelist that you manage yourself. And that's something we've kind of thought about as obviously very powerful, gives you the most control, but it's also something maybe a lot of content creators don't have the technical expertise to do themselves. Like they don't have the ability to go through, look at every marketplace, ensure that they're respecting royalties. And so another thing we've thought about is facilitating the creation of either like an official LAMINA1 whitelist or, community curated whitelists. So, and you can build reputation systems around that and all kinds of cool mechanics around it. But I think like that's the gist of it is you can either set that whitelist yourself and control, to your heart's extent, how that content can be used on which platforms, or you can sort of adopt a widely used whitelist that's maintained by a party whose like sole purpose and job it is to vet these marketplaces on your behalf.
Awesome. I think that was a sufficient answer. Also got a ton of questions just around, and I think you kind of got at this a little bit in one of our earlier questions, but like, how will people be sanctioned if they like don't stick to the rules? Like, what if, one of these white labeled like participants just like completely like is like, yeah, we'll follow your rules, and then completely just ignores all of the settings? Like, what do we have, or what do creators have in their power to sort of like act against these bad actors?
Yeah, this is a super tricky one to answer. It's something we're actively working on. But there, again, similar to how kind of my previous answer, there are different levels at which you can kind of catch bad actors and try to mitigate their ability to bypass some of these restrictions. So at the platform UX level, we can build sort of a centralized or even like pseudo-centralized, something run by community governance whitelist, or I guess in this case, a blacklist of content that has been found either by, an AI tool or a community jury or maybe even like a special counsel whose sole goal it is to review potentially violating content. And then that blacklist would be, again, respected by both LAMINA1 official tools and applications, but also tools and applications that we have partnerships with and that integrate with the platform. So that would, be part of our terms. And then at the chain level, we've thought about this. It gets tricky at the chain level because the only way to really effectively prevent or stop infringement once an asset or content has been minted to the chain is to build backdoors into any content. And that's, something we could theoretically do within the context of the studio process and people who are using the LAMINA1 hub itself to create their content and mint their content. But it's not something you can do completely enforce at the chain level, or at least it's not something we've really thought about doing. So, I mean, in theory, I guess we could say that nobody can mint content to the LAMINA1 blockchain unless it's through the hub. And then, maybe we could build in some of those backdoors, but it's a very heavy-handed approach. My guess is a lot of community members would be very kind of skeptical or cautious of us taking that approach. So, that it's one thing that's up for debate and something we can discuss further on down the line. But I think for now we're going to be working within the context of the application and platform levels, at least for kind of moderating content. And then as we go, we might think about how to kind of expand those controls and moderation functions at the chain level.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, one of the biggest things that even I've definitely taken in terms of early feedback from Creator Studio and rights frameworks is just what if someone credits me as a co-creator and I'm not a co-creator of that content? Or what if someone just right click saves my work and presents it as their own? So I know there's sort of stages that obviously we're going to be rolling these things out. I think, I don't know, Gordon, if you want to talk a little bit more about the sort of those sort of frameworks that we're kind of planning to put into place. But I know it'll start with a very simple report button, right? Where you can sort of hit something and say hey, I want to flag this content. And then, similar to, existing UI and processes for reporting content on Instagram or Facebook, you can be hey, I'm reporting this content, and it'll ask you sort of why? Well, I think this is copying, or it's not in the right place, or it's not crediting the right creator. And then obviously from that, there's a lot of really interesting considerations and to take into account, which is who is reviewing those reports? How do you create a decentralized community run place to sort of take those reports and decide the sort of juries that Will was talking about earlier? I don't know if there's anything you want to kind of add, Gordon, from your kind of product perspective around that before we jump on to some additional questions.
I think Will covered a lot of the possibilities around how you might deal with moderation in that context. I think, our goal is to create an experience that enables people to, co-create with other creators and do things in a very honest way. And so we're a little bit more inclined to focus on how to make that experience awesome, so people don't end up ripping the copyright. They actually are incentivized to respect and use the copyright as specified. If that makes sense, we really want to pave out those pathways to inspire and incentivize people to create content in partnership with others versus against them. And really kind of all these disputes, dispute handling, etc., is dealing with the latter case. But we think that if we can, really create a great experience and compelling experience that enables you to do things in a respectful way, then we're actually going to vastly outstrip the amount of content being created in a honorable.
Yeah, definitely. Like incentivize good behavior rather than like punishing bad behavior. Yeah, I feel like it's a good life lesson to follow by as well. We definitely have a lot of questions from community members. Aimwen Bulafi asks, I always ask what the next step is, or Olga 73035 asks, looking ahead, like what future enhancements or iterations are planned for enforceable royalties and customizable rights on Lamina1? Like, how do you envision like this early framework or these features like evolving over time on Lamina1?
I think about two parts to this question. The first is, really understanding kind of what people want to be able to do with their assets and how they think about licensing, copyright, etc. I know that we ran a survey recently that obviously drove this AMA as well. And I think really, talking to more teams about what's possible with this new technology and understanding how they might want to enable people to co-create with them, whether it's a gaming project or a film project or a music project or an art project, and making sure that we can we can encode the rights in the correct way, so and provide all those incentives, etc. that I mentioned before. So it's really very actively researching what people are doing and getting closer to kind of like the business needs that they have around this. And once we understand those, then ultimately we design the right technology to support that experience that they're looking for. Number one. I think secondly, and there was another question I think we skipped from Grateful around content originality, which I think is a really interesting question. Like, how do you know whether a piece of content is original? We've talked about some of the mechanisms to deal with that after the fact and moderation, etc. I know that there's just in general across the web space, the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, the C2PA, which was driven by Adobe. I think Meta and Google just signed up for it recently as well. And it's a mechanism for essentially encoding information around the provenance of an asset all the way, or starting from the point of creation. So if it's a camera, for example, using cryptography and to kind of track the origination of that photo, that it came from a camera that was owned by someone that has an identifier them. And once you do that, as the content moves through kind of editing or into a Gen AI system, being able to keep track of the provenance through all of these different tool sets and the different edits that are happening along the way, so that ultimately when it ends up in front of someone, you can kind of have its full, you can understand kind of fully where it came from. And how it was kind of used and edited, etc., which we think is really, really important. It's important for the web, not just blockchain asset systems. And so we certainly are very keen to think about how to integrate standards like that into what we're doing.
Awesome. We've also got a couple of like more specific questions that I wanted to address sort of at the end of the session. So IB Man asks, how will we receive royalties if there are any? Like, will the royalties be pre-staked? I know, like, so right now in our existing flow, there's a rights page and then there's a credits page. But spoiler alert, that credits page is sort of like this very early sort of like, first step is you need to identify who should be credited for this work, but then obviously sort of like once these royalties become enforceable on chain, like, the next question behind that is going to be, okay, what do they receive for the credit of that work, right? So I think like Will, Gordon, if you guys want to talk a little bit just about that sort of next step in terms of royalties, like how are those going to work, and what are the kind of next steps for that current like very bare bones credits page we currently show on the hub?
So yeah, so the first step, as you just kind of outlined, is to add support for royalties, and what that means is defining kind of who has a right to the royalty stream, how those royalties are split amongst your co-creators that you're crediting, and those essentially will be taken and on chain so that they can be items are transferred either directly between people or through some kind of marketplace, and that people are paid out as those transfers happen. I think that there is some really interesting stuff, and obviously in the context of limit break and how it deals with kind of policy control around those transfers. There's a bunch of things to think about there in terms of, if I send an item to a friend of mine, like, is there a royalty due? Because there could be some kind of out of band agreement that we have that I'm going to give 10 LAMINA1 in exchange for this item, and you'll send it. I trust you enough that after you send it to me, I'll send you the L1 or vice versa, and the transfer wouldn't have incurred any royalty. And so we think about whether or not there should be a flat fee, or we should allow the creator to specify a flat fee for peer-to-peer transfers, and then once it's actually being sold within the marketplace, honoring any kind of splits that you've defined in the context of that transaction, and that includes secondary, tertiary, and ongoing transactions. And what are the controls around that? Like, are you taking the same split for the creators of that item on every transaction? Is it full time? Is it all of those different types of controls and how you might want to structure that? And then also, particularly if this piece of work was created from an existing piece of work, what's the kind of chain of royalties to the original creator as well, and ensuring both in primary and resale that those royalties are kind of passed through and correctly to everyone involved. So that's really what royalties is going to start to build out. There are some really interesting things that you can do with a blockchain, actually, which particularly as it relates to royalties, like it's possible for you to split off the royalties as a separate asset, an NFT, and actually sell the royalty stream to someone else, but still
All right. Hey guys, it's not just me. Gordon just dropped off in the middle of a sentence. Sorry, Gordon, your connectivity is just a little bad, but man,
can you hear me now?
right in the middle of something juicy. Yeah, now you're good. Sorry about
Where
that.
did you lose me?
Oh my gosh. Gosh, I'd say about 20 seconds ago. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I think I was talking about with blockchains, it's possible to to kind of encode the asset. The royalty stream is a separate asset that's associated with the work. And what that enables you to do is essentially transfer the royalty stream to someone else. If you could sell the rights to the royalty to an investor or a community member or a sponsor, or even a portion of that stream. And so you can actually separate royalties from the item itself. I think is interesting, although that's obviously subject to regulation in the territory you operate. Selling future potential revenue to someone else can be covered by securities regulation. But again, for us, it's really about giving creators the tools, and then they would have to around some of these things and what they be able to allow or do.
Yeah, super interesting. Yeah, that was perfect picking up because you dropped off. You're like, yeah, you can separate and I was like, wait, I've never heard of this. And then of course you dropped off.
Well, yeah, and LB Man mentioned pre-staking. So that's the kind of that's like an idea where you might be able to take that royalty stream and stake it somewhere. Certainly not something that we're going to be building directly. but there's a lot of people trying to work out how to kind of like maximize the value of assets and be able to leverage them for financial use. There's a lot of precedent in DeFi space to support those types of mechanisms.
Super interesting. And Sanye6035 asks, are royalties also going to include like secondary or tertiary creations? Like, are we, obviously, royalties exist long after, the first transfer, the first co-creation.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Our first implementation of royalties and splits will support resale. There's going to be more questions around, or more control requirements in the future, I think, around people wanting to be able to control what those royalty streams look like over time. So you're taking more royalties up front and later on, or maybe you're only going to start taking royalties when something becomes popular, and things like that. So lots of considerations there into controls. We the studio experience, particularly around kind of all these different tweak in terms of what the flow looks like, because there's a lot of advanced edge use cases here. What we'll end up doing in the studio is kind of defaulting to defaults at a platform level or an individual, i.e. if I've created an item before and I've specified kind of the types of want around them and the royalty amounts, etc., for as the basis, and enabling you to kind of more deeply edit the configuration parameters, because it's going to get very kind of nuanced and complicated. And as you do that, we think about like, how can we help you make better decisions? How do I and how do I kind of model that over time, and assumptions around sell price and being able to model overall. Think of things like how make those decisions, because there's a lot of friction there. There's a lot of education. I think about integrating education into experience, I think, is critically important as well. And certainly our approach to creating an asset in unto itself is trying to remove a lot of the frictions in the first place, like decide what NFT standard am I going to use. Again, like think about that in every aspect. What rights level, what rights am I going to use, what royalties rate should be for this particular collection, like helping educate guidance process so that you're not having to go off and do your own research for 2 or 3 weeks before you make a decision. So yes to the question around secondary and tertiary. And again, like maybe you don't want any royalties for secondary and tertiary. Again, that's something that we want to be able to consider too.
Yeah, definitely. Kind of like on that note, I'm just going to drop our block survey form for creators' rights and royalties. So I just went through a bunch of responses from everyone who submitted questions for this AMA. Just kind of like, there's a specific question in general that we kind of asked folks, like, what sort of like rights or royalties like would you like us to consider or add? And there've been a lot of like really interesting things that people have been adding, a lot of which like Gordon and Will have kind of addressed now, which is, integrating like duration of right settings, or, being able to revoke royalties, or being able to say like, yeah, I won't take royalties for like the first part, but then once it reaches this certain threshold, a lot of you guys are like asking for some of these features. And I will say, like, a big reason why we're doing this education week now is like we're very actively kind of like building like what is MVP, and then how do we scale the system based off of like the creator templates and tools that we'll be releasing to creators soon. So basically, like, if you have any really interesting ideas, or being like, I'd love to be able to have this setting or this customizability, like, feel free to send us a note in this form. Like, as you guys, I'm sure, know, like, we're a small team. We take our user feedback and inputs like super seriously. We go through them. We bring them up in all of our sort of like product and development calls. So please, like, if you've got any sort of interesting questions or thoughts, like, share them in that form. Feel free to fill out that form as many times as you need to. because yeah, we're very much building this. And as I'm sure you guys can kind of like sense from the scope of the answers to some of these questions, this is a huge, like, uncharted territory for us all to be tackling, which is super exciting. Last question, maybe for you, Will. Gordon, you're breaking up a lot more towards the end of this AMA. But Todd Cross Fusion X Finance asks, how do you plan to ensure the sort of scalability and efficiency of these systems over time? You know, if we're all building what we think we're building, you know, there could potentially be a pretty large volume of transactions and interactions in the open metaverse and on Lamina1 as the platform kind of expands and evolves. So how are these things going to scale? Do you guys have any kind of like thoughts or engineering wizardry that you'd like to reveal to the community as sort of our last question?
Sure. So yeah, there's different kind of components that have different scalability needs. So we had talked a lot about kind of content moderation and this aspect of how do you kind of review content. And that's always been a massive scalability and resource question, even for some of the largest kind of platforms in the world. You know, I've known personally some people in content moderation on Twitter and on Facebook, and it's a really difficult problem to solve. I think that's where AI tools can be very useful in sort of sifting through some of the kind of the obvious cases. And then again, I mentioned a technique called random sample voting earlier, which is something, you know, one of my previous mentors, David Chan, had kind of championed a lot in particularly in election systems, which is the notion that if you randomly pull a jury from an electoral pool, then generally speaking, or statistically speaking, probabilistically speaking, they can make decisions that reflect the whole of the community. And so I think like a combination of AI tools and some of these random sample techniques could be really useful in making content moderation a little bit more scalable and efficient. As far as like the actual back end of the platform goes, particularly, I guess the more interesting question is around the chain itself. And that's something we talked about like in some of our very first AMAs and why we went with Avalanche originally as our platform. And it gets to the concept of horizontal versus vertical scaling. So vertical scaling, to like really simplify it, vertical scaling is really all about building up the capability of you know, a single server to manage you know, additional throughput. And so like an example might be like you upgrading your gaming PC to handle more demanding games. That's kind of the same process that people go through when they're scaling systems vertically, which is like as we get you know, more and more throughput and more demand from our users, we increase the size of the server. With blockchain, that's hard to do because you know, the chain is generally established at launch. It's hard to upgrade, and even if it were easy to upgrade, there's some like really information theoretic restrictions that keep you from really scaling it too much, especially in the context of EVM, which is what our platform is currently based on. There are ways that we're looking at to vertically scale, and that would include moving to non-EVM chains. So that would, an example of that is MoveVM. So that would be one way we're looking at in the future, is to launch some MoveVM chains that can handle more transactions per second on chain. That does come with some trade-offs, but I think that's maybe a discussion for another AMA. And then there's, yeah, the concept of horizontal scaling, which is kind of where Avalanche shines, which is like the concept, instead of improving the capabilities of a single node or a single server, or in our case, a single blockchain, you instead launch multiple blockchains. So you shard the transactions across multiple independent chains. And that's something Avalanche sort of championed. They're, you know, their architecture is particularly well suited for it. They've been building a lot of tools that make the process of communicating across these independent chains easier, more efficient, and safer. And so that's kind of how we envision the horizontal scaling going, which is if you have lighter requirements in terms of throughput, then you can stay, within maybe the Lamina1 chains, like the official Lamina1 chains on Avalanche. Or if you have particularly heavy requirements, like you're launching your own AAA game, then you could actually just launch your own subnet and blockchain, and you get your own dedicated EVM environment or MoveVM environment eventually. You can set your own economics, and all the bandwidth around that blockchain is dedicated to your use cases. But because of the Avalanche architecture, you can still move freely back and forth to the Lamina1 chains or other subnets if you needed to. So that's kind of like broad scopes, our approach to scalability.
Awesome. And with that, it is almost noon. We've almost hit the hour mark, so I'm going to close out. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Obviously, super meaty topic. I'm sure we'll probably revisit it again, especially as some of these enforceable royalties and expanded rights start rolling out with new content types and templates and expanded studio functionality on Lamina1. For all of you code hunters out there, I am going to drop our secret code for this AMA now. You can redeem it on Zeely for some points. As I mentioned at the top of the AMA, we are still pushing towards mainnet in Q3 2024, so this year. So catch up on your quests if you haven't yet already. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Anyway, we are so thankful for all the questions and feedback, and we are really looking forward to building out a fair, equitable, and innovative system for creator rights and royalties on Lamina1 together. I think one of the hardest things, but one of the most interesting things is, like, since we're building this from the ground up, we have a really, really unique way that we can kind of go about this, and we don't have to, fix a bunch of issues like some of the more big, like, mega platforms out there are. But obviously we're going to be testing, trying things out, soliciting feedback. A lot of the stuff that we're doing is pretty new in this space, so we're really happy to have you all with us. As always, I'll keep you posted on the Lamina1 core team's progress, and well fed with quests and testing feedback challenges in the lead up to launch and beyond. Thank you so much, and we'll see you guys again. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Will. Thanks, Gordon.